Go back to the release of Normandy, and there was one tank that was the bane of every single Axis player. This tank was so powerful that it was considered uncounterable. Nowadays, however, this tank is a joke. And honestly, it has gone from being the most feared tank in the entire game to not even a top 5 tank. And it hasn't been a top 5 tank for a long time. So, what is this tank and why was it so feared? Obviously, if you've seen the title, it's the Jumbo. I'm not sugarcoating it, it's the Jumbo. This is the story of the Jumbo and more or less how it fell from grace. How it got its reputation as the most feared tank in Normandy, and how that reputation slowly died, and how Normandy Axis essentially turned this once overpowered vehicle into one of the biggest jokes in the entire game. First, let's really talk about some stats on this thing. The Jumbo is unlocked at level 20, meaning it is a tier 2 tank. It's the only tank for the Tanker 2 squad in Normandy, and it has some really terrible weapons, ironically. The 75mm gun isn't a joke, and actually does a bit of damage, especially with its HE, as it's able to kill Pumas and Panzer IVs with just the HE. However, this doesn't account for the fact that the AP is actually pretty bad for killing tanks, because it has no armour piercing filling. If you don't know how most AP works in Enlisted, when you fire through the tank, there's actually a filling that basically scatters around the tank, kind of like shrapnel. This is what's mostly used to kill the crew. And this is how some tanks like the Tiger is so good, because the Tiger has so much HE filling that it basically will eviscerate the entire tank and kill every single one in the tank without really meaning that it's a one-shot kill. The Jumbo doesn't have this, so you have to individually kill each member or aim for a certain hit point, such as the ammo rack. Otherwise, you are pretty much going to have to slowly grind through the tank. Despite this, however, it has one advantage. That being, it's got a very, very heavy armour. And that front armour is nothing to joke about. Even the Tiger, which has the best gun in the entire game, in Normandy that is, hasn't got a chance of penning this. You have to essentially hit it at weak spots like the MG ports or the tracks in order to get through. Because of this, it's actually quite difficult to kill Jumbos if you don't know about its weak spots, as rounds will just simply bounce off. Even the 75mm gun of the Panther, which is very good at piercing tanks, doesn't have a chance at piercing the front plate of the Jumbo. This armour is really what gave the Jumbo its bad reputation, and the reputation of it being the most overpowered tank in the entire game. When Normandy first dropped, there was only 26 levels. And there was no Tigers, there was no Panthers, there was not even a Panzerfaust. For Axis, the only weapons that they had for taking out these tanks was their own tanks, the Junker 188 bomber, explosive packs, and Sturm pistols. And to put it bluntly, the skill level for Normandy was very low at this point. People did not know where to throw explosive packs, or even that explosive packs were meta at this point. So, people just didn't use explosive packs too often. It didn't help that some of the maps, like Ruins of Volks, really encouraged grey zone camping, so Jumbos were essentially safe from death. This meant that the Jumbo would only have to be killed by the other 3 methods, that being of course the tank, the 188, and the Sturm pistol. Unfortunately, all 3 would require skill to use. This wasn't of course like the Panzerfaust where you could just click on a tank and it dies. The Sturm pistol actually requires a lot of skill to use successfully, and while yes, with the correct user you can destroy any tank with it, Back then, like I said, the skill level was much lower. Many people consider the stern pistol to be useless. Even Quadro thought that the weapon was useless, and I had to physically show him in a game that the stern pistol could destroy a jumbo, and even then, he didn't take it seriously, believing that the tank was empty when it actually wasn't. Despite this, however, the other two options also required a lot of skill. The 188 would require a lot of positioning, and while bombs were very powerful back then, and if you pretty much bombed anywhere on the map, it would kill the entire enemy team, not many people used this, and a 188 in the air was often shot down quite quickly because rear gunners didn't exist back then, and the 188 was completely defenseless. Other than that, there was only the Panzers, but back then we only had the Panzer III, the Panzer IVs, and the Puma. And most people writ off the Puma because, well, they didn't think the Puma could actually kill a jumbo, despite the fact it is possible for Pumas to kill jumbos. It just requires some actual skill. Because of this, people would turn to the Panzer III and the Panzer IV. The Panzer III is terrible, so most people just went to the Panzer IV. And because the Panzer IV pretty much is glass and really has a bad turret speed with a J, most people writ off the Panzer IV, and so the jumbo got its reputation, and unfortunately it would keep this reputation for the longest time. When Berlin came out, really Allies got two big buffs. That being the P-47 and of course the Thompson. Whereas the Axis didn't get anything to really counter it. While the Focke-Wulf can take out the P-47 quite easily actually, back then it wasn't considered a good aircraft because of its control capabilities or lack thereof. And really, people were not hesitant in using it as it didn't have much rockets compared to other fighter aircraft like the P-38, so most people just writ it off. That, alongside the Thompson, people beginning to use the M2 carbine effectively, people actually stopping using the FG-42 and seeing that it isn't as overpowered as it used to be, and also some other stuff like the Thompson pretty much dominating the meta, made it so that the jumbos being really overpowered pretty much just kept rising and rising, with many people only saying that it could only be killed by explosive packs, despite the fact that I've got video evidence of the time period of me killing jumbos with Sturm pistols. Despite this, however, that meta would soon change, as Axis Normandy would receive one of its most needed changes. That being the update that added in 3 much needed additions to the roster. The MP-43, the Panzerfaust, and in particular, the Panther. The Panther was the immediate go-to, and many people thought it would be the thing that would finally end the jumbo's reign of dominance, and it kind of wasn't. You see, while the Panther could stand up against the jumbo and could kill jumbos quite easily, it still had the problem of the 75mm gun, but it had one main advantage. It was unkillable from the front from jumbos. However, from the side, a jumbo could easily kill it. Because of that, jumbo players who were actually competent and could actually use the tank other than park in a bush could be a competent Panther player, quite simply. The Faust, on the other hand, was a much needed change, and for many people, is probably the go-to thing for killing jumbos nowadays. With this, the jumbo became less strong. In fact, I would argue that jumbos, while they were still being utilised, it wasn't to the standard that they were being utilised in the past. However, one update did begin the death note for the jumbo, and that was the Stalingrad update, ironically. This was because it added 3 features to the game that really made it pretty hellish for jumbo players. The first one was the Tiger. The most obvious change, obviously, the Tiger was able to essentially counter the Jumbo completely. And when people figured out that it could front pen the Jumbo by shooting its front tracks, it was game over. A Tiger player, even one who's not really competent, is able to beat even the most competent Jumbo players. That and the fact that the 75mm gun is useless against the Tiger's heavy armour, yet it was no surprise that this thing was essentially the counter that Axis players had been begging for, and what Axis players had thought the Panther was going to be. The second thing was, ironically, machine gunners being added to aircraft. This made 188 bombing runs actually very viable now, even after they were nerfed, because they could actually still defend themselves from attackers. After this, however, there was one final, really just more forgotten change, and that was the fact that the 76mm Sherman, the M4A1, was added. This was a complete perfect tank, to be honest. It has very powerful weapons, and even though it doesn't have good armour, it doesn't need good armour, because really it can just take out most Axis tanks frontally, including the Tiger. Because of this, the Jumbo began losing relevancy, because most higher level players would begin using the M4A1, or even the Firefly, ironically, over this. Later on, in Burning Skies, the Viketten Panzerbushel was added, which was essentially a long-range Jumbo killer. And because of this, the Jumbo's shortcomings began to be really well known and noticed by the player base. Its AP was terrible, and really it started falling out of favour. In fact, Jumbo players are either people who don't know that it's out of meta now, or have just unlocked the tank. It's ironic that this tank has a premium squad, and yet that premium squad is not only is it worthless nowadays, but it's also overpriced. Despite this, is there a way back for the Jumbo? Yes, but I don't think the player base would like it. The only way I can see the Jumbo really making an appearance and a comeback is if its AP ammo was changed from AP to APC-BC. The reason being is because AP ammo pretty much sucks, and honestly, it's just worthless, whereas APC-BC ammo is essentially what every tank is using at this point. The only tank that is good at killing other tanks that doesn't use this is the Scott, which uses heat ammo. Now, will this revive the Jumbo? Maybe, maybe not. It will still struggle against Tigers, and really, if a Tiger player knows about the front weak spot, then they are fucked. That, of course, and TNT charges being added, anti-tank mines being somewhat usable, and also bombing runs will make this kind of more of a... It's more of a, if they add it, will it revive it? If not, well, the tank's already dead. The Jumbos essentially was more of the community catching up to the fact that it is a pretty bad vehicle, rather than them essentially being nerfed into the ground, like so many other weapons. Kind of like the FG, when it kind of lost relevance when people realised that there was an actual counter to the FG and that the weapon is boring as fuck to use. The Jumbo got a reputation early on as the most overpowered death trap, but then it would lose it and people would realise, man, this thing is just bad. I wonder how many other meta vehicles and meta weapons will soon get this treatment, because let's face it, there are lots of stuff that you would just use and you think, man, this is god awful. Anyways, I'm going to end this video here. I hope you guys have enjoyed. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video.